will start perhaps by explaining a bit about how this novel got written. It was part of the Shakespeare project of the Hogarth Press, where noted novelists are asked to reimagine Shakespearean plays in a modern idiom. And this was Howard's choice. So if I'm going to start by asking you the obvious question, why Shylock?
This sounds as though I'm trying to pick an argument, but it wasn't my choice. I was contacted by my agent as I was finishing my previous novel, which was called J, and which almost won the Booker Prize, but didn't win the Booker Prize. But we're not going to curse about that. These things happen to a writer. And I didn't know where I was going to go next. I normally know where I'm going to go next, but I didn't this time. And my agent suddenly rang through. It's the kind of call you hope you're going to get when you're finishing a book. Hogarth Press have come up with this terrific idea for modern writers. They're scouring the world for the world's best writers, and it's always nice when you're included in that list to do modernizations of Shakespeare. For me to have anything to do with Shakespeare is like being asked to be in the presence of God. Shakespeare, for me, is the greatest writer there has ever been. Such a great writer, it's mystifying how Shakespeare could have done what he did. But let's not go there. I said, that's terrific. I'd like to do Hamlet. He said, I'll find out. He said, they said you could do any play you like. Hamlet, I'll ask them. And he came back, he said, any others? And I went through Macbeth, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra. I went through the early comedies. I went through the problem plays. I went through the tragedies, through all the late plays. I then started to go on to the plays that people weren't even certain Shakespeare had written. And I'd missed a play out. And finally, I thought, it's The Merchant of Venice, isn't it? They want me to do The Merchant of Venice for very obvious reasons. It was a play. I've taught Shakespeare and I've written about Shakespeare. My very first book was about Shakespeare. But I'd never written about The Merchant of Venice or been particularly interested in The Merchant of Venice, partly because we'd done it at school when I was 14. Not a Jewish school, but there were 15% Jewish boys in my class. And the teacher said, Jacobson, you can read Shylock. So I read Shylock, and I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed by "Hasn't a Jew eyes?" That famous speech. I wasn't embarrassed because I thought this is an anti-Semitic play. That didn't bother. I didn't think what I was reading was in the slightest bit anti-Semitic. It was almost as if it was too much the opposite. The special pleading for the Jew in some of those famous speeches embarrassed me. I thought, no, I don't feel like that about being Jewish at the moment. And I pushed the play away. And they never had anything to do with it because it always seemed to me to be an issue play. School kids read it, and the question always is this play anti-Semitic or not? It answers itself, actually. If you've read any play by Shakespeare, you know Shakespeare couldn't be an anti-Semite. It's impossible for Shakespeare to have been an anti-Semite. His mind was too large. He did not have a prejudicial mind. He might not have loved Jews, but you don't have to love Jews. I mean, many of us don't love Jews all the time. So that's no mark against Shakespeare. But an anti-Semite? No, he couldn't have been. So I wasn't interested in that issue, really. But anyway, I said, okay, let me reread the play. And I reread the play I hadn't read since I was 14. And I thought, this is a marvelous play. It's full of interest. And Shylock is a towering figure. I was wrong to have been embarrassed by him. And those people who say it's an anti-Semitic study are profoundly wrong. They misread the play, they misread Shylock, and they misread the other characters too. So once I saw that, I thought I can get my teeth into this. This will be a marvelous, challenging thing. That's the quick answer to your question.
Well, maybe you can give us a quick excerpt from your book.
Just a couple of minutes introducing you to the way this novel worked. When you write a modern novel based on an old work, you kind of think you'll do equivalents. So, who is the modern equivalent to Shylock? Who is the modern equivalent to Portia? Where's the modern equivalent place to put them? And I had a modern equivalent to Shylock, and very, very quickly I was bored by him. I was very interested in no, it's not right. I wasn't bored by him. I thought he was inadequate to the task I was setting him. Not inadequate to the task of writing about being a Jew now, because that was always going to be part of it, a Jew now, a Jew then, but he was not big enough for Shylock. And I thought, I actually can't conceive anybody big enough, as big as Shylock, but Shylock. So I decided Shylock has to be in the novel. So Shylock is in the novel. Don't ask questions, he's in the novel. Doesn't matter. This has caused none of the reviewers a problem. Shylock is simply in the novel. He's seen at the beginning of the novel by this other character who was going to be Shylock but isn't Shylock, called Simon Strulovich. And the two men strike up a relationship and even quite a close friendship. A sort of an almost would-be now Shylock meeting the real Shylock. And if you had a chance to meet the real Shylock, there are lots of questions you would ask him. Can you imagine you're sitting on a train and suddenly you're sitting next to Shylock? I've got so many things to ask you. Not, what did you have for breakfast yesterday? Or do you know a good restaurant in Venice? Not that kind of question. But questions such as, did you mean, when you talked about that pound of flesh, did you mean it? You called it a jest at the time. Was it really a jest at the time? You're stopped from murdering Antonio. Would you have gone ahead and done it? It's always assumed that had Portia not stopped him, he would have done it. But we don't know he would have done it. People go very close to an act of murder. And for a Jew, of course, there is the famous story of Abraham and Isaac in front of us, where it looks as though Abraham is going to kill Isaac because God told him to do it. And then God stays his hand at the 11th hour. But would he have done it? That's the question you would ask Abraham if you found him sitting on a train next to you. But you're unlikely to find Shylock one day and Abraham the next. Anyway, so Strulovich invites Shylock to his home and can't help, whenever he feels he's got Shylock at his mercy, asking him a question of this kind. So that's what this scene is about. Let's see how it goes. Strulovich couldn't leave alone the matter of what Shylock had intended. A chance comes along, you take it. And Shylock was looking more relaxed than he'd seen him, sitting in the half-dark with his legs outstretched, listening to the silence whenever Strulovich allowed it to be silent. A man easy to ambush. Not for the first time, Strulovich resumed, you elude my question with the story stopping. Yes, the story stopped, but you haven't. You are here. You have had time enough to reflect. Reflect? I do nothing but reflect. But reflection is not action. It is not even knowledge of action. I don't have the answer to your question. I don't know if I would have gone ahead and taken flesh from around his heart, or even, since you have asked me this before, how the heart suddenly became the site of my revenge. Aha, so you call it revenge. I do, and willingly. I had much to avenge, my daughter, my wealth, my reputation. And a bloodthirst to slake? Now you sound like them. Then show me where I'm wrong. Do you wish you had not been stopped? Stopped? Shylock narrowed his gaze. Suddenly he did not look as relaxed as he had been. I wish, for all the good it does me, that I had not been thwarted. What, from taking his heart? No, from finding out whether or not I could have done it. So you wish you had. That is not quite the same thing. Had I done so, they would not have hesitated to take my heart. Strulovich waved that consideration away. He wasn't interested in consequences. He knew all about what they did to Jews. What intrigued him was what a Jew might do to them. Let me trespass on your good nature one more time, he pressed. Would you have done it? And one more time, I don't know. I have no more taste for blood than you do. Those men I mentioned to you early who faint during a bris, well, I am one of them. Twice I've fainted. It was that or cry louder than the baby. Like you, I'm made of the softer stuff, and equally hate the sight and smell and even thought of blood. But understand, my own blood was up. My hatred for that superior, all-suffering, all-sorrowing, sanctimonious man boiled in my veins. There was, I believed, as he no doubt believed of me, no room in this world for both of us. We denied each other. He could not allow me to transact my way, and I could not allow him to transact his. I stood for order, he for chaos. We both, of necessity, dealt in obligation. To be in business imposes obligation, and to be a husband, a father, a lover, imposes an obligation too. But I dealt in true obligation. I gave and I took, a quid pro quo that was agreed to on all sides and left nothing to doubt or misunderstanding. He, that Antonio, dealt in false obligation. He could bear only to give. He would not profit financially or emotionally, so he must always be sacrificial, disappointed, and alone, which imposed a hidden but constant obligation on those he gave to. I could not function in a universe as raw and haphazard as his, and he could not function in a world as rational as mine. My legalistic rigidity, as he considered it, cancelled him out. His emotional coercion cancelled me, which is why one of us has always to kill the other. So yes, it's possible, or at more than possible, that in that fuming rage I would have found the wherewithal, the joy even, the obligation, as though answering a commandment from a furious God, and as a long-owed return on those centuries of Jew-despising, as a requital of the slander, and as a perfectly ironic eventuation of all their baseless fears. Yes, it's more than possible that I'd have found what was necessary. Call it the heroic strength, call it the bliss, call it, if you will, the villainousness, to take what by any reasonable computation was owing to me. I felt myself to be, I won't pretend otherwise, the instrument of justice. By the measure I was used, would it be measured to them? And there's no violence a man is not capable of when he believes he is acting as God would have him act. And before you say anything, I am as aware as you are of the blasphemy of claiming such an entitlement. Let's include that then in what I might have been on the point of summoning up, the blasphemy of taking life. Had it come to that in God's name, except that it didn't come to that. So I am sorry. I cannot tell you what the act of murder feels like, and whether at the point of a knife I would have gone ahead and done it. But I can tell you how it is to be brought to the threshold of murder, and to wish with every part of oneself that ministers to resolution to cross over. Does that go any way to answering your question? But Strulovich is asleep in his chair, worn out by too much anger and frustration, too much alcohol, and not impossibly, too many questions. Shylock, though, has another explanation. This Strulovich has a profound moral reluctance to stay awake, he thinks. This Strulovich asks, but he doesn't want to know the answers. Jews are sentimental about themselves, and this Strulovich, though he can't decide if he's a Jew or not, is no different. A Jew, by his understanding, is not capable of what non-Jews are capable of. A Jew does not take life. I am a hero to him by virtue of what I permitted to be done to me, not by what I did or might have done. Good Jew kicked, bad Jew kicks. If you prick us, do we not bleed? But if we prick back, do we not shed blood? Strulovich would rather not know.
Thank you for that. What do you think Shakespeare was trying to tell us about Jews through Shylock?
I don't know whether Shakespeare even ever would have put it to himself that way. I think Shakespeare would have in that rough and ready way he had as a man of the theatre, looking for the next new play, the next new story, the next new success. Christopher Marlowe had written The Jew of Malta, and people had gone to see that, and it might very well have been that there was an interest in talking about Jews in the country at the time, which is itself very interesting because there were none there. One of the great mysteries about anti-Semitism is it does just as well when people have got rid of Jews. You don't have to have a Jew there to hate a Jew, because a Jew actually is an idea. A Jew is a much more abstract thing than he is an idea. When people hate Jews, they're not actually seeing any particular Jew. It's beyond that. So that was an interesting fact. That's an interesting thought to have about the time he wrote this. So he may very well have thought, this is an interesting thing to write about. People are, for whatever reasons, talking about that. Christianity is re-examining itself.
Yes,
Catholics,
but he gives us a sense of humanity in Shylock.
that's what I was coming to, yes. So it's the humanity which will interest Shakespeare every time. It's not Shylock, what is it like to be, I don't think Shakespeare has got a hell of a lot to say to us about what it's like to be a Jew, because he doesn't know. I know more about what it's like to be a Jew than Shakespeare does. I don't know much more than Shakespeare, don't know anything more than Shakespeare does about anything really except this. I know what it's like to be a Jew, and he knows nothing about what it's like to be a Jew. We all know in this room more about what it's like to be a Jew than he does. But he knows more about what it's like to be a human being somehow or other because of the way in which he has looked into being a human being and the linguistic resources he's brought to thinking about being a human being. And what it seems to me happens, because that's what Shakespeare is like, he takes this story, it's an unpleasant story about a Jew, and he cannot help himself. The Jew becomes alive. It's not just because everybody becomes alive in Shakespeare, but because I think he has an over and above interest in making alive those characters who are alienated, who are disliked. He clearly, in play after play, doesn't like mob responses to someone, and the person who is a victim of mob responses, Malvolio, Othello, you can think of that, Caliban, always engage his sympathy, and more than his sympathy, his fascination. What is it about this person that annoys so many other people? He's interested in the annoyance as much as anything. What is it about a person who is unlike that goads? So it's the unlikeness he's fascinated by. And in that creative act of imagining a man, we get something that's beyond the charge of anti-Semitism. It's not a pro-Semitic. To argue that the play is not anti-Semitic is not to say it's pro-Semitic. This is not Shakespeare saying, I'm going to do well by the Jews. He's got no reason to. Many horrible things had happened to Jews that Shakespeare would have known about. But some of the most horrible things that had happened to Jews were still waiting. So we have no reason to suppose that Shakespeare owed it to the Jews to save them imaginatively. What he does, though, is he saves an individual man from a prejudice.
But when you had to think about some of these things, when you were planning what you were going to write, how difficult is it as a writer to put words into Shylock's mouth? Because that must have been quite a challenge.
It was a huge challenge. And it felt, you want a definition of chutzpah. That's chutzpah, to go where Shakespeare has been. So you tell yourself, first of all, it never bothered him. He took everything. Almost every play he wrote is taken from somebody else, and this story is taken from I think you said earlier, there is existing material about Shylock. There is an Italian book he may or may not have read, and behind that book is much other book. He takes an available story and he does what he... So you have to tell yourself, the fact that I'm stealing from him, he couldn't complain about. It's only we modern writers who are squeamish about theft. In the past, it wasn't how it was thought about. You were keeping the ball rolling. These stories were current and you kept them going. So I thought, okay, I'm going to think the same. I'm keeping the story going. But if I'm going to do Shylock, and it's going to be Shakespeare's Shylock that's walking my stage, the stage of my novel, then it's going to be very hard work. And it's the hardest piece of writing I've done, and it might be the piece of writing I'm most proud of, because I had to continue to give Shylock that stature. So there had to be a gravitas here. There had to be a real weight, and you had to feel the real force of character at the same time as I wanted to justify something else about Shylock, Shakespeare's Shylock, which is that he's a man of enormous wit, sense of humour, rapidity of personality, and sometimes great charm as well. So he's also, not only is a person of gravity, who has suffered not quite a tragedy, because partly his own fault, he fails of tragedy. He fails of tragedy, and he allows himself to be humiliated. His fault. We can't save him from that.
Yes,
but he has a sense of the ridiculous. Sorry.
He was outspoken. I mean, Shylock sticks his neck out.
He certainly does, and he provokes Antonio and Bassanio and all of them, and when they joust verbally together, he wins every time. It's one of the reasons they can't stand him. They say Jew, Jew, Jew and spit on him, but they often say it when he's just bested them in an argument. He's too quick for them. I always feel I've got to be careful when I say that, because I don't want to be caught going around the world saying how clever Jews are again, because we all know that the most despised Jew is the clever Jew. But I'm afraid Shylock is a clever Jew. Now, whether Shakespeare knew that Jews were particularly clever and particularly quick-witted, I don't know. It's impossible ever to know what Shakespeare knows.
Okay. What I found reading the novel was that you are also clever, because I've got to tell you that the contemporary version of Lorenzo, the young man that Jessica runs off with, you know, when she runs off with a Christian and he gets all upset about it, he depicted as a soccer star, and set it in Manchester. And there is nothing more appropriate in Manchester, where a lot of the soccer stars happen to live. And I think that was the neighbourhood you were trying to talk about, right?
Yes, South Manchester, North Cheshire is an area which is known to estate agents as the Golden Triangle. They're very expensive suburbs, very well-heeled, sedate suburbs. And there used to be a lot of good English old money there, where there would have been a kind of that polite English anti-Semitism that means no harm really, but just off the top of its head is somewhat disdainful of Jews.
What do you think is the difference between anti-Semitism in Shylock's day and today?
Well, of course, English anti-Semitism in
I don't
Shylock's
expect you
day
to
is
talk about
abstract. It's abstract because there were no Jews there. Now, if a person wants to be anti-Semitic in England, and there are some who do, they have a real Jew to look at. Though, as I said earlier, I think anti-Semitism it predates a real person. I don't want to get into this. One thing I don't want to talk about here is Israel, but there is no explaining modern anti-Semitism without talking about Israel, because anti-Zionism, and I'm not going to get into that, is an anti-Zionist, an anti-Semite. Might he be? Could he be? Is he always? Is he never? And all that. But there's no question that anti-Zionism allows anti-Semitism to mutate into a new form, and it's allowable. And you can say some shocking things about Israelis that you can't say about Israeli Jews that you can't say about Jews. When you point out to people who say these things, don't you realize you think you're making a political statement, but you're saying exactly the same thing about Israeli Jews as medieval Christians said about Jews themselves? They say, well, that's just coincidental, but it's not coincidental.
But is it state-sponsored anti-Semitism, or is it neighbor to neighbor? Because you've got now in England, just because that is where you live, a lot of Jews who just are quitting. They are leaving. They don't.
It's not true that there are a lot of Jews. I mean, who knows? It's not true that there are a lot of Jews. There are some. There are, in my understanding, more Jews leaving France than are leaving.
Definitely more.
There are more horrible things happening to Jews in France.
But certainly they're happening in
here.
England as well.
There is some, but it's not much. And this is, I'm frequently on panels talking about this one. Is it time? Only recently we had a panel, and the question I put was, when will we know it's time? When will we know it's Kristallnacht? And some Jews will say, oh, come off it. It's nothing like that. And I will say back, but German Jews would have said the same. When do you know? What's the moment when you know the thing turns from a fear into, something tangible?
You say in the novel that the one thing that Simon always thinks about is this. He always has to have enough money and enough resources to get out if he needs to. He may not want to go to synagogue, he may not want to identify with Jews, but he still keeps his little bag of gold coins, as it were, in his back pocket so he can flee, because he knows it might happen.
Yeah, I think that's a very Jewish thing. I won't go so far as to say that at the back of every Jew's mind is the readiness to go. That's to go too far. But I would have thought somewhere there is that possibility that no place is forever for a Jew. We are not here, which is why, the buying a stud farm and riding horses, which is the sign of a kind of permanence, really. You belong here, you belong to the earth. It's hard, I think it's hard, certainly for my kind of Jew, that's to say me and the Jews I know well, to feel that the earth belongs to them, that the country is theirs. Let me tell you something, it's easier to be a Jew in America, I think, because you've been welcomed for all sorts of reasons. This is much more a country of immigration than England was when the Jews first turned up there. And this was a country in which Jews were allowed to have to play a part in the shaping of the culture. So, if I was to talk about the modern American novel, for example, today I'm going to talk about the modern American novel, tomorrow I'm going to talk about the modern American Jewish novel, they'd be the same thing. The part Jews have played in the culture of this country is immeasurable. And sometimes when you think about what American culture is, you think, well, it's certainly part Irish and it's certainly part Italian, but it's to a large part American. English culture is not like that. That doesn't mean you're unwelcome. That doesn't mean you walk in terror every moment of the day, but you never quite feel that the place is yours. And partly because when we turned up, remember we'd been thrown out in the 12th century, and so when Shakespeare writes Shylock, there'd been no Jews in the country, a few hiding around, but not many, for 300 years, and it's still another couple of hundred years, another 150 years before Jews come in. By the time Jews come back again, when Cromwell lets them in again, the culture is a formed thing. It's a culture that knows what it is, and while it was a culture that was mature enough and remains mature enough to make space for people from outside, it just makes a little bit of space. But it doesn't make so much space that you can take that culture and move it and twist it and change it. Indeed, I was brought up, and many of my Jewish friends were brought up, not even to try such a thing. Go quietly, be very, very quiet. My father said, you just stay stumm. Stay stumm already. And when I wrote my first book 30-odd years ago, and it wasn't that Jewish a book, but it had a Jewish hero, to my surprise and to my parents' surprise, because they didn't think I was that interested in the subject, both they, other members of my family and friends, wondered if what I was doing was wise. I might make the British notice that there were some Jews there.
Let me finish by saying that the wisdom that you heard tonight is replete and even more, even richer in the book itself. It's not only the story, it's the insights and the humor that I have to recommend it highly to you as something that teaches you about yourself as well as just an enjoyable read. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving it to us. And thank you for being here tonight.
And thank you for your questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.